Hey friends, it's me, Em again, and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things sinister. If you are interested in true crime, or if you like all things horror related, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. That way you can join me for some morbid conversation. So for today's chat, I'm actually going to be walking down memory lane. And the reason why is because growing up, my family was very into professional wrestling. We all had our favorite wrestlers. We would never miss an event. We would always watch like Monday Night Raw, pay-per-view events, the whole nine yards. We knew it was scripted, but despite that, it just was such a huge part of my childhood. We really got into it. Now, when me and my brother got older, the interest kind of faded, but it was still a really big part of my childhood. And today we're going to be talking about one of those wrestlers from my childhood. Imagine my surprise when I became a true crime loving adult to find out that a wrestler that I had grown up with ended up killing his wife and his son before committing suicide. And that wrestler that we're going to be talking about today is Chris Benoit. Before ending everything in 2007, Benoit had a very successful career in professional wrestling that spanned over 2 decades. It began in 1985 at Stampede Wrestling, where he would stay on for 4 years and win his first title match in March of 1988. He would end up moving from Stampede Wrestling to the New Japan Pro Wrestling, where he would spend the next several years. He would then do a very brief time with the WCW, which is the World Championship of Wrestling, in June of 1992, but he would stay less than a year before going back to Japan. He would move on to one more company, the ECW, or the Extreme Championship Wrestling, where he really began to take off in popularity. This would be another short time frame in his career, only lasting there for about another year before his work visa would expire. During this time, Benoit would actually break another performer's neck when he would pick him up and try to execute a move that involved throwing the wrestler over his shoulder. The move did not execute properly, and the other wrestler, Sabu, would not achieve a full rotation, which would result in him landing directly on his head, breaking his neck. Benoit was very upset about this, thinking that he obviously gravely injured this other wrestler. He was worried he would be paralyzed, but amazingly, not only did Sabu recover from the injury, but he recovered to the point where he would continue his wrestling career. Ironically, Benoit was nicknamed Crippler before this match, and his nickname would stay, later being modified to Crippler Benoit or the Canadian Crippler Chris Benoit. Finally, Chris would be called back to the WCW in 1995, and because of his talent, he would be approached by Ric Flair at that time to become part of the wrestling group known as the Four Horsemen. He would make the fourth member of the team alongside Flair, as well as Arn Anderson and Brian Pillman. So we all know that professional wrestling is scripted, and a big part of the script that was going on at the time was the beef between the Four Horsemen and Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage. The Four Horsemen would actually end up later forming an alliance with another wrestling group known as the Dungeon of Doom, and they would form an alliance against Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage. So that alliance would actually end up ending when a new feud would be scripted for Brian Pillman of the Four Horsemen and the leader of the Dungeon of Doom, Kevin Sullivan. Kevin was actually a booker for the show, and what that meant is not only did he help write the scripts of the feuds between people, but he would actually coordinate the matches and everything to kind of carry on the drama of the show. So he's the one who's not only feuding within these wrestling groups, but he's writing the script. So before they were actually able to write any kind of storyline to complete this feud, to climax this feud between Kevin and Brian, Brian would actually end up leaving the WCW and going to what was then the WWF, a different wrestling network. So it left the storyline incomplete. So, to kind of continue the story on, they would end up writing Chris Benoit to carry out the feud with Kevin. And I don't want to say, what's kind of ironic is Kevin was the main writer in this feud, kind of the main person who coordinated the script to keep the drama going between the Four Horsemen and the Dungeons of Doom, or specifically the problem between Chris Benoit and Kevin. During his time in the WCW, Chris Benoit was actually married to his first wife, Martina Benoit, and the two of them got married in 1988. However, their relationship was kept very private, and this is because of the scripting that was written for his wrestling personality, Chris Benoit. And the reason why that is Kevin, the guy he's feuding with, who also writes the scripts, wrote out the character of Chris Benoit having an affair with Kevin's real life off screen wife, Nancy. Now, Nancy was Kevin's actual wife, but she was also what was called a valet. If you've ever watched any kind of professional wrestling, especially back in the day, they had women wrestlers, but they also had valets who would like escort out the bigger wrestlers and would kind of be like their arm candy almost. And Nancy was Kevin's valet and also his real life wife. So it was scripted to continue this feud between Benoit and Kevin, that Nancy was scripted into having an affair with Chris Benoit. So to play up the feud, the two would be seen together in public. They'd be seen holding hands. They were seen playing off each other a lot, which is why Chris's marriage was very private. They wanted the affair with Nancy to look authentic, to look very real. They wanted the two of them to be seen together. And it ended up turning into a real thing. It went beyond just being scripted. Nancy and Chris Benoit actually did end up falling for each other, and they both divorced their partners. Nancy divorced Kevin, and Chris divorced Martina. So people kind of joked that Kevin essentially scripted out his own divorce, because what started out as a performance and a fake affair led to a real affair, which led to a divorce. So before Martina and Chris Benoit got divorced, they did have two kids together. Benoit and Martina ended up getting divorced in 1997. Benoit and Nancy would end up having a son together in February of 2000, and the two of them would end up getting married on November 23rd of 2000. So Chris and Nancy's son Daniel actually was born with and diagnosed early on with a condition called Fragile X. And what this condition is it is something that mentally and physically stunted him early on. And it's often accompanied with autism. Now, Daniel's specific condition isn't widely known to the public because Chris and Nancy actually made a point to try to keep it as private as possible, to keep it out of the public's eyes and out of the media's eyes. In fact, they were even pretty quiet about it with their friends and didn't talk a lot about it. However, his condition did cause a lot of tension and fighting within the marriage. Nancy wanted Chris to spend more time with them. She wanted him to be home more often. She wanted him to be there to support her and to support Daniel. And because of Chris's career, he just couldn't do that. He couldn't be home nearly as much as Nancy wanted him to be. In 2003, Nancy filed for a divorce against Chris Benoit, and she also put in for a restraining order against him, saying that their marriage was broken beyond repair, that Chris treated her horribly, treated her cruelly. She said that often he would get angry and he would throw and break furniture, and it was just not a good situation for her or her son. However, she would end up withdrawing her application for the divorce and for the restraining order, and their marriage would continue. Chris would end up losing his best friend and his colleague, another professional wrestler named Eddie Guerrero, in 2005 to acute heart failure. Benoit was absolutely devastated at this news, as the two were not only colleagues who had worked together for years, but they maintained a solid friendship outside of work. After his death, Benoit would end up keeping a journal that he would use to write letters to Eddie almost every day. In fact, the loss was so devastating on him that Nancy would try to convince Chris to quit wrestling because she worried about his mental health, because going and continuing to do this career and going in on tour at these places that he had shared with his best friend that he had lost, she worried that it was going to end up being awful for his mental state, and it turns out it was. However, Chris's wrestling career would continue, and he would end up moving from the WCW to the WWF, or later known as the WWE, and he would stay with that company until his death in 2007. His final match would end up being on June 19th, 2007, and he defeated Elijah Burke on this day. By winning this match, it put Benoit in the position to wrestle in a title match on June 27th. Benoit essentially called in to work that weekend saying that his son and his wife were very sick and they were vomiting up blood and he had to stay with them. He would end up not showing up for that title pay-per-view match without calling or notifying the network at all. Because of this, they would end up subbing a wrestler in for him and telling the audience that it was due to a family emergency. Benoit was scripted to win that match had he shown up, but instead it went to the one who subbed in for him, Johnny Nitro. Fans cheered for Benoit the whole time, despite the fact that he wasn't there. Because of him not showing up to his scheduled event, the WWE actually called the police station to request a welfare check on Benoit and his family. The call to the police was placed on June 25th of 2007, and the police would end up entering Benoit's home and finding him and his wife and his son all deceased. Nancy and Daniel both died due to strangulation suffocation. Nancy had been bound beforehand, while Daniel had been drugged with Xanax beforehand, which would have likely caused him to be unconscious during the murder. They would find Benoit hanging from his lap pull-down machine. WWE would end up running a 3-hour tribute special to Benoit when they got news of his passing, where they would bring in other wrestlers to talk about the impact that he had. They would show matches of his, and it was pretty much a memorial service that they gave to Chris Benoit. And they did this before they knew the surrounding circumstances of his death. After finding out more details about the death and the surrounding circumstances, Vince McMahon would actually come out onto air and basically apologize and kind of clear the air of it. And from that point on, his name was completely scrubbed from the network. He was not mentioned again. He was not shown on merchandise again. He was not shown on flashbacks. There was no trace of Chris Benoit tied to the network at all anymore. And that's because police ruled this as a double homicide and suicide. They had enough evidence to show that Chris Benoit killed his wife first on the first night, where he tied her up, he strangled her, and after she was dead, placed a Bible on the floor next to her. They had evidence that he went to his 7-year-old son and drugged him and suffocated him and placed a Bible next to him. And on the third day, after killing his wife and after killing his son, he went downstairs to his home gym. He wrapped the cord from his lap pull-down machine around his neck, added some weight to it, and essentially hung himself with the machine. But between the journal entries that they had to Eddie, where he had been writing to Eddie, alongside a note that was in a third Bible that he had left there, it was pretty obvious that is what happened. He killed his wife, he killed his son, and then he killed himself. When they did the autopsy, Chris Benoit had several drugs in his system, including Xanax and hydrocodone. He also had elevated levels of testosterone, but they ruled roid rage out from the beginning. And part of the reasoning, from my understanding, is though Benoit had done steroids in the past, This they thought was something kind of to counteract his steroid use in the past, where he had abused them so much, it kind of depleted his ability to make testosterone on his own. And so he had started taking drugs to make up for the drug use that he did in the past. That's from my understanding. I'm not sure how accurate that is, but it did say that they do not believe roid rage was involved. Media speculated roid rage right out the gate, but it seemed pretty definitive in my research that roid rage was ruled out. A lot of people were actually surprised by this murder suicide because Chris Benoit, his kids meant so much to him. And if you look at his home videos and if you look at his pictures, he loved his kids and he loved spending time with his kids. And this caught a lot of people off guard that he killed his, not only his wife, but also his youngest son. And his ex-wife, Martina, had nothing but good things to say about him. When this happened, she also was in disbelief of it because she just thought that he was a nice, kind guy. Granted, he was short-tempered sometimes, but a lot of people had nothing but good things to say about him, and a lot of people were completely caught off guard. Like I said, WWE, when they found out that he had passed, had done a memorial service on him because they hadn't considered that he would be the reason behind the deaths of his family. Christopher Nowinski was a former wrestler who actually ended up becoming a neuroscientist. And he became a neuroscientist because he recognized in professional wrestling getting hit on the head so many times, it does a lot to your head and it does a lot to your brain. So he ended up studying neurology, and like I said, he became a neuroscientist. And he reached out to Michael Benoit, Chris Benoit's dad, and said, hey, have them look at Chris's brain, have them take a scan of his brain when they do the autopsy, because I have studied brain damage in athletes. And when you have multiple concussions, that can cause brain damage, which can lead to behavioral changes. And so they did. They did a scan of Chris Benoit's brain. And when they did, it was comparable to an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. So his brain was severely damaged from all his years in wrestling, from taking metal chairs to the head, from hitting himself on the ground. His brain was essentially mush. Now, Nowinski had also commented that he had only seen 4 brains within the athletic world that were damaged in this sort of way. And it was 4 former NFL players, 4 former football players. And their brains were damaged, and one of them ended up committing suicide. One of them ended up doing a high-speed police chase, which resulted in their death. And then the other ones resulted in behavior that was either damaging to themselves or to others. So it shows kind of a history of having this type of brain damage resulting in violence toward others or toward yourself. So they think that that might be a link between what happened that night, that weekend, because it was so out of left field. Nobody expected it. And he just all of a sudden snapped one weekend. So we don't know specifically what caused Chris Benoit to snap that weekend. We do know he had a history of drug use. We do know that he had pretty severe depression, and it was made even more severe after he lost his friend Eddie in 2005. And we also know that he had a severely damaged brain. And it could have been any of these things. It could have been a combination of these things. But honestly, we don't have a definitive answer for why he did what he did. There's a TV series called The Dark Side of the Ring, and it is something that you can watch on Hulu. And on season 2, episode 1 and episode 2, there is a 2-part episode on the Chris Benoit case. And it kind of goes into the history. It talks about people who are involved. They interview one of Chris's surviving children. They interview Nancy's sister. They interview wrestlers that had worked with Chris Benoit. It gives you a really well-rounded kind of personal experience on this story and a deep dive into this story more so than this video. And it's very interesting to watch. Even if you don't like wrestling, if you're interested in true crime, it's up your alley. It's very interesting because it's just one of those cases where we don't know the answer. It just seemed to come out of left field. But that's it. It is a very unsatisfying ending to the story because we don't know why it happened. We don't know what the motivation was. Not that there's ever any justification for murder, but usually there is some sort of reason or motivation. And this time there just isn't. He just killed his wife and his son one weekend for no reason. And we don't have any answers, and we're not going to get any answers because he is not here to answer them. Um, yeah. So there you have it. That is the crazy story where if you're in the wrestling world, very famous wrestler ends up going and committing familicide, family annihilation. And it came out of left field. There was no warnings, there was no nothing. He just one day killed his wife and killed his son and then killed himself. Anyway, friends, thank you for joining me for today's chat. If this is the kind of content that you're interested in, don't forget to hit that like, comment, subscribe, and share button. And make sure you turn on all post notifications. That way you can be notified the next time I sit down here for another morbid conversation. Until next time, as always, stay safe, take care, and I'll talk to you later. All right, friends. Bye.